want to give my bit on Android versus iOS and this whole market share debate. So, why is this even a subject? Well, beyond the passionate fans on both sides, I go to the horse's mouth, and that is Steve Jobs himself within the keynotes, basically giving us the context, framing the debate and saying, hey, we have market share here, we have activations here, so on and so forth. I believe it was WWDC 2010 that Jobs gets up, gives an update. It's a Nielsen graph that shows for Q1 of 2010, Jobs, I think, says that iOS has 3 times the market share that of Android. And then says a few other things, and then even goes into browser share and showing the different mobile browsers and how much usage they get. And then kind of concludes and says, well, I hope that puts things in perspective, this and that. So obviously the debate has been framed. We have the context, it's there, it's therefore open to discussion or debate, what have you. Also, some of the arguments originate in these keynotes that Steve Jobs gives. For instance, September 2010, Jobs goes into activations and actually it gets very articulate and goes to the point is like, we have 230,000 new activations, and we think some of our friends are including upgrades in some of theirs. This doesn't include upgrades. If we had upgrades, it'd be, a bazillion or something. So obviously, the arguments are in themselves also enticed or instigated by some of these keynotes. So really, what are some of the arguments outside of what the keynotes are in? I'm constantly either reading in articles or hearing, whatever. One of the biggest ones is, well, this is a repeat of Mac versus Windows PC. Now, I'm apt to say, hey, I see your point. I mean, after all, why not? There are many similarities. And some of the arguments made is, well, hey, Apple had so much market share back then, and then they lost it to Windows. And see, it's just the same because Apple had the market share, and now they've lost it to Android. And then, of course, the other, well, Apple is closed, and they lost market share back then because they're closed, or they're too controlling, or they're this almighty dictatorship, what have you. Now, the defending arguments will say, oh, well, no, I mean, things are different, and look, Apple's making money. But I would say to that Apple also made money back then. They actually were making fairly large revenues for back then, in the late 80s going into the 90s. Of course, it didn't last forever, but while market share was evaporating in the late 80s going into the 90s to the earlier versions of Windows, Apple was indeed making money. Then there are the side arguments that segue after a few points have been made and it goes into market share, and like, well, I don't understand why anybody would want Android. There's no user experience. How can that be? And then, of course, the Android users are going to say, what are you talking about, user experience? You guys are too limited over there. You don't have freedom. That's not a user experience. I mean, you guys live under this almighty Steve Jobs, a dictator, and all these kinds of jargons like that. Then I love where both sides will say, well, normal users wouldn't do this, right? For instance, consumers, when they buy Android, it's just because they don't really know what they're buying. They just go in there. I would say to that, whether it's iOS or Android, it's a smartphone. It's a pretty big purchase. And people that I've worked with, clients I've been to, whether they have iPhones or Android, they know what operating system they use. The Android users that I know are very content with it. Some of them, like some lawyers that I know, they like even specific hardware models, and that's why they didn't even opt for the iPhone. The iPhone didn't offer them full QWERTY, and they wanted full QWERTY, but they also wanted the power of Android. So I think it's a very conscientious purchase for the consumer to say, hey, this phone needs to do something for me. I have these needs and it needs to be fulfilled. And a smartphone being a much larger purchase than a regular cell phone, I would give credit to the consumer and having some sort of credit in what they're going to be buying. And then there's my favorite article that would dub, well, those that want Android, all they really want is to surf the web, play some games, read email, have some applications. Well, you get that with Android. You obviously don't want a magical device with iOS. Now, I chuckle at that because they're pretty much listing all the functions off. Of course, and I'm sure the argument will be, well, there's just no finesse with Android and this and that. But I still found that kind of a comical thing to say. Then there's the other iOS argument against Android. Well, it's not uniform. It's not the same experience everywhere, and you can't get updates, this and that. I would say that purchases like a cell phone it's purchased because it satisfies what they want. If there is an update, perhaps that is going to fix a problem or error with the phone, I'm sure that then it would be something that the consumer is going to say, hey, well, where is it? If it's doing what they need, really, if they're not really into operating systems and I guess that geeky, I would then say a normal user is not going to be so concerned, because if the phone's satisfying their needs, they're going to be satisfied. Hence, now, if they somehow get wind that an update's going to provide them with the service that they are seeking for their phone to further do, then perhaps they would be looking for those updates. And for this whole thing about normal users, my opinion is that users buy what they want, what is going to satisfy their needs right then and there, if I haven't said that enough. For an Apple user, or even an Android user, but mostly from Apple users, a lot of their statements are saying, well, like I was bringing up, it needs to be uniform from device to device, like the next generation iPhone. Well, that's already employing long-term consumer loyalty, which then pretty much is not buying a phone for right now in here to provide my functions. That statement is it's including an exponential variable of an expectation and saying, oh, well, I'm going to stick with this brand for each model coming up, versus just saying, well, this is what I need now, and it excludes any other type of perhaps new paradigm shift within the technology, or maybe killer new technology that comes up. So I kind of think that these long-term forecasts was saying, well, from phone to phone or whatever, I can grab a phone and then the next iPhone 5 and the stuff will be the same. Normal people, again, they're buying the phone. It's got to do what they want it to do, and how it's functioned. Whether it's an Android phone, maybe it's HTC Sense or some Samsung layer on a Samsung phone. If it does what they want it to do, they can get to pick it, and they make a conscientious choice of what suits them. And the same thing goes for iOS. Hey, user wants to get iOS, boom. It may just be that magical experience for an iOS user. For those Android users that think, oh, how can someone pick iOS? Well, look, the demographic exists. There are consumers for every flavor out there. Then my favorite is, well, Android is just cheap. Huh? We're talking about smartphones. I'm sure there are maybe a few Android phones that might be a little cheaper. I take that back. AT&T is advertising the iPhone, the 3GS, for $49. Hello. And the whole point about Apple is that they make great price points. Like the iPad, I think this whole cheap thing is just totally an irrelevant, unfounded argument altogether. Then there's going to be well, you can't make the comparison. You can't do it. Because Apple's making one phone, Android runs on many phones, of course. Android's going to have larger market share. But then again, I would go back to Steve Jobs and saying iOS activations, and look how many numbers we have, software for software. So I say many times, Apple themselves and the other companies that are the competitors frame the debate in terms of software operating systems. Then, of course, well, it's the profit share. Oh, Apple's king of profit share. I've seen some crazy formulas out there trying to explain this profit share thing. I would say it's totally bogus mathematics. I mean, just fuzzy. I mean, there is no real measurement that I would go to that would be credible. However, of course, you could measure against revenue and earnings and things that are reported. But then my argument would be, well, all this profit share, the only really other competitor that would be comparable to Apple would be RIM, because RIM really only sells smartphones. Everybody else's profit share is going to be lower. They sell cheap cell phones. There's a lot of profit to be made in more expensive phones. These are typically high dollar unsubsidized devices, and therefore profit margins will be higher on these devices versus in the inclusion of like Nokia, which has tons and tons of cheap cell phones. Samsung, they have tons and tons of cheap cell phones, and so on and so forth. So the statistics of profit share for all smartphones, and eventually when everything is a smartphone, will it'll just become marginal, in my opinion. I mean, that's pretty much the same thing that they were doing with Macintosh. They were selling Macintosh at a higher price. Market share was evaporating, and they were making profits on these Macintoshes in the late 80s going into the 90s. And kind of the same thing, you have high dollar items. Okay, so now for my opinions. I do not think it's the same as Mac versus Windows PC. And also I want to make a statement in saying, why does this have to be a death match where one is beaten to a pulp dead on the ground and the other one is just victorious in this? I mean, this is nonsense. Don't we all for friendly and healthy competition? But getting back to why I think it is not the same. The analogy to Microsoft can't be made because the roles are reversed. In other words, Windows really controlled the OEMs, dictated a lot. After all, they were Microsoft versus the US over many antitrust violations and things that were happening. A very powerful operating system that really dictated a lot of rules to the OEMs. Android, on the other hand, I consider a gift, a very large gift to handset manufacturers and cell carriers. In essence, Android's identity is that to which the cell carriers and hardware manufacturers dictate in a much greater, larger part than was the relationship between OEMs and Microsoft Windows. I mean, quite frankly, carriers dictate a lot, even to whether they work in conjunction with hardware manufacturers like HTC in making layers, or access to the app market, or what technologies that they want, or branding. Branding's a big thing. You can build a handset, you can build a mobile operating system, run on it. If you can't get it to a carrier or get carrier approval or abide by carrier rules, it's not happening. It's not like where you can just build a PC or have a startup PC and just throw hardware parts together and put an operating system on it. I mean, these carriers are dealing with municipal and regulatory laws, sometimes a natural monopoly to lay an infrastructure, telecom infrastructure down, so on and so forth. These are not PC vendors. And again, going back to the layers like HTT Sense, something that Jobs had made a point on is that before the iPhone, carriers controlled really in the majority of everything that went on the phone. An example of that would be Motorola's Droid. Droid comes from Verizon, but that same phone, if it weren't in Europe, is a different name. So Droid is a Verizon creation, and yes, come to the Droid thing and the commercials, and that's how you come to Verizon. I mean, it's total branding to get people to become Verizon customers, for here in the U.S. In Europe, I don't live there. Maybe some of that does go on over there, but from what I know, consumer habits are a bit different. So, while Android will be market share victorious, I just can't see Android wielding the same stick that Microsoft did with Windows and deals and things like it did with the OEMs. Essentially, Android's nature is it is open. Its licensing is totally different. And the other point that I want to make is that Apple, along with like RIM and a few others, there's not very many of these phones, but Apple made an autonomous phone for as much as it can be to participate within how telecoms work, the cell carriers work. I mean, here in the U.S., yes, AT&T had some feature limitations because of their network of technical things, but there was no branding. Apple owns the brand and the identity, and basically, it's a big, powerful point because it keeps Apple Apple, despite carrier rules or branding manipulations that they may want to try to impose. Now, I also do want to say, but Android has done the same, or Google with the Nexus 1 and trying to make what I would call that autonomous phone. The other powerful thing that Apple has done is another quote from Jobs where he said, before the iPhone there wasn't a free market of applications. Very, very true. There was some microcosm of application markets out there, but nothing like what we have with the App Store. That is something that I would say is similar to as Windows became a market share. Bam! A lot of software titles would go to it, and actually to the point where some big players would say, well, the Mac's not significant enough for us to develop for. That is not happening with Apple, even though it's lost a lot of market share. So at WWDC 2010, it was stated that there were 5 billion downloads, 250,000 apps, and 1 billion had been paid to developers. Then we go to the last keynote, which was in March 2011. It is then stated, well, we have 350,000 apps, 10 billion downloads, and then 2 billion paid to developers. Seems to be like a 1 billion paid to developers for each 5 billion downloads. But that's a short period of time from June to March 2000, June 2010 to March 2011, another 5 billion downloads versus how long it took to get to the 5 billion mark from the inception of the App Store. I think that's a big old graph, going up. And essentially, Apple has this ecosystem that it can really plug any device it chooses to participate within its App Store and utilize that the amount of software titles that it has within the App Store. Now, some of you know my position on apps, that I always say that there's a threshold of having too many apps. And then there's also a threshold of having too few. But maybe that's a damn good problem to have, is too many software applications, if you know how to handle it right and can sift through it and maybe make better search tools and stuff. So, Apple maintains this identity versus the carriers. And I foresee if everything goes smartphone, that carriers will want to have even more say-so with app markets to even drive more users to themselves. In other words, it's not going to become enough to brand the phone themselves and name it and do everything else. That they want to have their own little app stores, and they may be able to get away with that within Android. Point being is that I see Apple being more agile and Android being more weighted in how it deals with the carriers. Whether you want to, believe whether my predictions are wrong or right about what happens to Android and how it can deal with carriers, the essence of that it has to deal with carriers, I think, is far more weighted because there's so much more carrier pressure and branding and all these aspects are dealing with carriers that have so much influential power over Android versus Apple that I just think Apple will be more agile in the end. So, to conclude, we can go back to the main argument of, the Mac versus Windows PC and the whole market share and how Apple lost. While it is true that market share can significantly make a company very powerful and very wealthy, it does not kill another company. Market share in Windows is not what brought Apple to its knees when it was at its weakest in the mid-90s. Apple did it to themselves through software identity crisis, product inventory problems, whether there's too little or too many, and so on. So that's the reason of any on why this is not the same or can be compared. Apple's doing everything right with their inventory right now. I don't see the same problems plaguing it. They have an identity, and that's why I've been using that word identity the whole time. And yes, I know many, oh, but Mr. Bit, you argue about licensing out OS 10. Yes. I go by many of the former executives that work at Apple that say they could have. Also, my main point about licensing out OS 10 was to try to counter-influence Windows, because Windows became like this de facto knowledge standpoint of how every damn computer should be, or what an expectation. When there's plenty of other operating systems out there, just so you get some Windows user on a Macintosh or Linux system, and all of a sudden they're projecting problems that they experience within Windows, and they therefore form as expectations on the computer itself. But again, while that could have helped sell more units, my point is that the market share of Microsoft influenced its own space. It wasn't a drowning effect that Apple could not coexist with. And I'll say it again, Apple is to blame for bringing themselves to their knees. It wasn't market share, it wasn't Microsoft Windows. It was themselves. And in the words of Steve Jobs would say, I hope that helps put things in perspective for you. Thanks for watching.